Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much to all of you for coming. I'm very conscious of how close we are to Thanksgiving and the dire reports of traffic that those of you who'll be travelling are going to have to face. So it's fantastic that you've taken time out this morning to be with us, though I am not surprised because of our guest who's with us today. Just a quick word about the Global Europe programme, which I chair for the Woodrow Wilson Centre. This is a programme that we've designed to do something a little bit different because it looks at the pressures and stresses and issues that confront the continent of Europe, whether that's the Arctic and the issues of climate change and trade, whether that's migration, whether that's the big relationships with Russia, with China, and of course with the United States, and whether it's issues that confront it in many different and challenging ways, of which our guest, Alex Rondos, will be able to talk extremely eloquently, in this case, around the Horn of Africa. Alex needs probably no introduction to any of you. He has been the European Union Special Representative for the Horn of Africa for, he tells me, 8 years now. Is based now in Nairobi and has been working on issues that concern all of us throughout his long career, but perhaps especially now on the Horn of Africa. And I'm going to begin by asking him a few questions and then invite you to join in the conversation. This is on the record. We have C-SPAN here. We're delighted to see you. And we hope that people watching this will enjoy it as much as you will. So it's a great delight, as you know, to have you here, Alex. I'm a huge fan of everything that you've done. And I know how much you have contributed to thinking through the issues, the policies, the ideas, the objectives of what Europe, but not just Europe, can do in the Horn of Africa. But begin by telling us your remit, the geography of it, the politics of it. What do you cover?
Well, thank you, Kathy, and good morning to everyone, and thank you for coming here. Delighted to be your guest. You were the one who first set me off on this jaunt in the Horn, and it's rather lasted, and my hope was always that at least I would try to keep it out of the crisis in tray for you. The remit geographically is the traditional Horn, but expanded to include now Sudan, South Sudan, so it's Eritrea, Ethiopia, Sudan, South Sudan, Djibouti, Somalia, Somaliland, as part of Somalia, as it were, Kenya, and Uganda. So it stretches down into some Eastern African issues. The EU arranged it in such a way that the remit was to be sort of all things to all people, as the EU does. It sort of has clauses and sub-clauses to every text and order that it gives. But at the time, the real hot issue was Somalia, 8 years ago. Piracy, how to deal with Shabab, where would Somalia go, and Somalia is part of the region. So the remit really became one where I was the only person who had such a role, which was unusual. Secondly, that a lot of the people, the leaders in the region, I think were surprised, pleased, that there was an attention being given at a political level. And frankly, you gave me kind of an open book, as it were, to be as entrepreneurial as possible in dealing with all the different crises. But what emerged, and I think this is where, from a European perspective, we could play to one comparative advantage that we have, which is that in the EU, we're dealing daily with squabbles among member states. The question is, we created a framework within which, at the very least, you don't pull guns out, on the whole, and we haven't for a while. and therefore trying to get a whole region which was, despite its geographical name of the Horn of Africa, is a pretty disaggregated place. It's not integrated in the way that other regions are, and therefore getting the countries among themselves to get used to finding ways of communicating with each other, preventing crises. And a lot of the work that I've ended up doing is stuff that just doesn't appear in the public eye. Nor do I spend much time seeking permission to do something, because you have to move fast in order to resolve issues. So it involved Somalia and its neighbors, Kenya, Uganda, Kenya and Ethiopia above all, and certainly lately, Sudan, South Sudan, Sudan in its wider setting. And as things have developed, it's really become about how this region called the Horn, one, begins to resolve its internal national disputes that it has, of which there are a number, and we'll go into that, the relations among the countries, and the most recent challenge is situating and helping a region navigate its way into a completely changed geographical landscape. The dynamics coming from the Indian Ocean, from the Gulf, are totally altering the balances. And from a European point of view, and I'll just conclude on that, our challenge then is just to say, well, are we as Europe, this is the sort of soft underbelly of Europe. It's just immediately below North Africa. And it's on on one side of the Red Sea, where a lot of our trade goes through. Are we, in this changed global setting, and given what is going on in the region right now, going to become spectators, or how do we engage and how do we define our interests as Europe in this changed setting? So there's a lot of firefighting and occasional attempts to be prophetic and translate that into some kind of longer-term policy.
I told this story before a few times in my life, but when Somalia got to the point of having some kind of government, I remember flying in on a cargo plane with you to the airport in Mogadishu, when the control that the government had was probably a square mile, and we had a tin hut and a flag and a bed and a bedside table, and that was the embassy, and we put you in it, and I have a photograph of you lying on the bed in the tin hut, and then we raised the flag of the European Union as a means of showing that although we could hear that there was a lot going on a mile away, that we were committed to trying to support the people of Somalia and through them the people of the Horn of Africa. I mention that because that for me was a kind of beginning. 8 years have passed. What's changed? What's the thing that you really notice, or the things that really strike you as different, good or bad?
Yeah, it's this country is going through a transition, this region, and key countries within it, notably Sudan and Ethiopia, but also Somalia, through a transition of a depth that is akin to what Eastern Europe went through in the early 90s. That is how deep the change is in this region. And I think that's the first thing to bear in mind. Secondly, we need to understand why this is happening. And we need to look at demographics. 70% of the population is under what? 30, 31, 32. And we all need to wake up and understand that this generation has now gone politically operational. And we will be making a serious mistake if we think this generation should simply be treated as numbers in a development project, to have the umpteenth youth project. Lovely, but they're going in another direction, which is to say we intend to have a say in what we think we belong to. Do we outside understand what this entire generation, it's a demographic tidal wave breaking over the politics of the region. And that's just mathematical. You don't have to be a political crystal ball gazer. to understand that. But do we know enough? Do the leaders in these countries even know enough about what is going on? What are these aspirations? What are their loyalties? So that is the fundamental change. If you look at what happened in Ethiopia, and look at what happened in Sudan, you see this youth bulge, as it were, just suddenly becoming political. Protest is meeting politics. Is politics capable of absorbing protest? Is really what's going on in this region. And it'll take different shapes. Therefore, what's happening in Sudan and Ethiopia, for example, 150 million people. Those are the sheer numbers that are involved. The fates of both those nations, I think, are up for grabs. What is happening is very exciting. Are we outside ready to speed up, scale up, get engaged in a way that's needed? Or will we be, polite bystanders making interesting analysis while this goes on? Why? Next question, big change, is that the region has now become part of a whole new set of global competition that's going on. The politics and the geopolitics and geoeconomics, as it were, of the Indian Ocean have spilt over into the region. It's not what we're doing. It's not what the United States is doing. It's what China's doing. It's India beginning to show a real interest. It is the Gulf realizing that they have a Western flank and literally strategically doing a 360-degree turn and saying we've ignored that other side of the Red Sea. So the engagement, I think, is there. It is irreversible. And at the moment, what's happening is it looks as though there is, if you will, a new scramble, not just for this region, we should look way beyond. That scramble, the only difference, the methods are very similar. It's about finding local clients, local collaborators, and the like. And the only difference is that we Westerners and the former colonialists are kind of bystanders and watching this. And the assumption that we were the players in this region, I think, is changing. Now, where that will go is huge in terms of its implications. And I think it behooves us all not just to analyze it, but ask us where we fit. Why? Final point. If we agree that there is a new generation emerging, which is going to be decisive in how it defines the interests of their communities, their nations. And my working assumption is that many of the aspirations that generation has are not dissimilar to the aspirations we have in the West for our children. Are we doing enough to engage that generation? So our policies have to be very, very carefully calibrated here because it's a very, how can I put it, plastic moment. And who we align with. I mean, the simple challenge, as I put it to certainly the member states of the European Union, is are we going to end up on the right side of history? That is how deep the change is. And I'd put the same question here too, in the United States. It is unstable, it is uncertain. We have a view of stability which includes acknowledging that the popular will has a role, if it is acknowledged. Many of the other players who have chimed in do not represent what I would call a sort of an illiberal, as opposed to liberal, approach to politics. And that is where we have to work out whether stability from the barrel of a gun can be replaced by stability created by a more participatory politics, which is what is being forced on some of these countries.
One of the issues for Europe, and I think for the US, is in a world where there are so many different challenges that confront everyone, the crises always get ahead of what you might call the strategies that can prevent the crisis that may be coming towards you. if you could change things, if you could have the resources or get the political attention or whatever it is from European Union or Europe more generally, politicians and political thinkers, and indeed in the US, what are the ingredients that you think could make a difference? You've talked about being aware of the value of popular will. You've talked about the players who are coming in from the Gulf to China to India and so on. What is it that you think Europe, the US could and should do that could make a difference to the future of these extraordinary young people?
Objective one is, if we agree that there is a transition of tectonic significance that's going on, and it's the generational one, we've got to make sure that that transition in political terms gets stabilized. We all say, and everyone immediately when they engage in a transition say they'll have an election. Every single one of these countries is going to have an election in the next 2 to 3 years. Well, 1 to 3 years. In countries going through profound changes where it's not quite clear whether the old still has a grip or whether the new that's coming in will grab the grip, as it were, on the political machinery, and in countries which, do not yet have deeply embedded in an institutional capacity to act as shock absorbers that come and must address the competitiveness of electoral politics. So what therefore needs to be done, this is the next 2 or 3 years. Otherwise, frankly, this is just, it becomes an interesting but academic debate. Where Europe can step in and has every interest of doing so is to begin to convene everyone from outside to say, let's make sure that we don't pick apart and allow a region to be picked apart by the old methods of the past, historically. And so it would be about bringing and talking to the Gulf and engaging in a very straight discussion about this. And the Gulf, I believe, got a bit of a shock when they saw the reaction to some of what 1 or 2 Gulf players were doing at the beginnings of the changes in Sudan. The street basically said, they objected to what some of the Gulf players were doing. Fine, mistakes occur, misjudgments occur, but they reflect deeper inclinations. We need to get everyone around the table and come up with a common understanding on what it's going to take to stabilize. 2, resources. The money simply is not there to meet the aspirations of people who had been told for years, wait and the good life will come. Frankly, in the meantime, the leadership was going to the global pawn shop called the debt market and selling the family jewels. That's in effect what's been happening. So we have a massive debt problem that has reemerged, which is going to further create problems to meet the aspirations of this generation, who are becoming very political. If they don't feel there's a purpose to which they can work, they will go in any other set of other directions. Their loyalties will go. Now, we've therefore got to think about how you mobilize money, and to sit there and say, we Europe don't have enough, or the United States doesn't have enough, is not a policy at all. The policy is, how do you mobilize all the resources that are available and work out who can, what's the business plan and the cash flow plan, if I may put it in very simple terms, that begins to address the aspirations. You simply cannot tell, of 100 million Ethiopians, 70 million are kids, half of them kids, 30 years old, I take the liberty of saying that. Half of them are men who are unemployed. Well, what do you expect when it comes to election time? What is it one is able to offer? And I don't mean just charity. It's about real new types of investment. It's about getting governments to understand what can be done. if the international community is not coherent, it will merely reinforce any incipient incoherence in the region. We will mirror each other. And then we'll be sitting here in a few years' time wondering what went wrong. And the answer would have been, we ironed the wrinkles into the shirt instead of ironing them out. That is the core question at the moment. And I think we've got to have the self-confidence to say there are certain things we believe in and we're ready to invest in and bring others on board. And I mean anyone. The object is to put some coherence into the international system at the moment. And that I have a lot of faith in an emerging generation which is totally wired and connected. Okay, they're talking across frontiers, they know everything that's going on globally. There is a nucleus there of new leadership that can be emerging that I think could begin to reshape some of the politics of the region. That is what I think we need to be doing, if that isn't too general, but that has to be a strategic objective. If we stabilize the next few years, then there's the breathing space then to look at the next stage, by which time you hope that the new generation is going to express itself and say much more clearly what it wants, rather than what we think it should want.
So my last question is, when you're lying in your bed in Nairobi thinking about all of these issues, thinking about the potential of this young generation and the connections that they make, but also the challenges that they're going to face with such high levels of unemployment. The push towards elections, which I always describe as the cherry on the icing on the cake of democracy, and the assumption that gets made so often, particularly in countries going through transition, which is chaotic, that if only they can have an election, everything will be fine, rather than understanding that that does not give them all that democracy has to offer by any stretch of the imagination. When you think about this landscape, what keeps you up at night?
One is that there are sufficient individuals of considerable influence in the region, but also outside, for whom it is not in their interests to go down this path. Deliberation is a painful, messy business. That's democracy. Okay. Two, and here's I think the key issue that scares me, and I think we're asleep at the wheel. Yes, terrorism is there, and I don't mean to in any way diminish it, but I'm seeing something else in the last, and you asked me what are some changes that have occurred in the last 8 years that I've been doing this. It is what, and I want to be clear, this is not just about this region. It is the rising criminalization of economies and politics. What we saw in West Africa, the international organized criminal syndicates are saying, the Horn of Africa, that's a useful place through which we can operate. And the more you open up, people flow in. Likewise, regimes that are very closed actually are using criminal methods in the management of their economies. What's the point here? One of the very interesting things that's occurring with what the youth are saying, when you really listen and look at the social media, they're asking very simply, where has the money gone? All right? A question that some of us would have asked of our own governments at other times. All right? Now, so this is not unique to this particular region. This is fundamental. Simply talking about anti-corruption is not there. It is a criminalization run by emerging cartels who risk, and the risk is that they will begin to capture parts or whole of states. Now, fortunately, there are people in governments who see that and know it. But it is fascinating that this is what's emerging. And if we don't wake up and understand that terrorists are in effect piggybacking on this, is one. Al-Shabaab has become effectively a self-financing organization. That's what it is. In other words, is this a terrorist organization or is it a mafia operation cloaked and wrapped in religion? Okay. These are questions we need to dig in much more deeply, because if we don't, we're going to get surprised with some really nasty stuff. In other words, follow the money, but get serious about it. Governments must do it, we must do it. South Sudan is a classic example. You know, we're on the record, I will repeat it. I fail to see why we should be investing in a country where we're engaged in an exercise in moral hazard. We're negotiating with the same people who stole the bank right now. And we're being asked to get ready to put more money in. Well, I'm not sure I would ask European taxpayers to do that. Keep the indigent, do the basic humanitarian, yes, but how do we address that? How do we address the fact that other countries in the region, their networks are complicit in this? Sudan, we want a civilian to see the civilians begin to get control. Fine, in a country which has had 30 years, the longest single Islamist regime, which created its own economic cartels. Those we barely scratched the surface. How do we deal with that? It's not just us, we've got to talk to others who are also engaged, friends in the Gulf and elsewhere. But if we don't begin to get to the heart of that, we will have missed a trick, and the people of the region will have felt that they've been tricked by nice words, quaint projects, but in the meantime, the money's running Venezuela, as it were.
Follow the money. Alex, thank you from me. Now, this is your opportunity for comments and questions, but all I would ask is if you could keep them relatively brief, because we want to hear more from him. Important though you are, I am reliably informed, and there is a wonderful Mary with a microphone in her hand. So there's a gentleman there. If you could just say who you are, just because we're curious.
Yeah, my name is Bashir Goth, and I represent Somaliland here. I know Ambassador is very well engaged with Somaliland. That's why I'm going to ask you this question. I would appreciate if you reflect on Somaliland in terms of its contribution to peace and stability in the region, in combating terrorism and piracy, and its political situation in a changing Horn of Africa. Thank you.
Somaliland is in a very interesting historical position. This is in a region unique in Africa, which has already seen 2 secessions legitimized, if I may put it that way. And you, representing Somaliland, would probably want to be the 3rd that is legitimized. The reality at the moment is that I'm not going to get into whether you'll get recognized or not. That is for your neighbors, your own people, your neighbors, Somalia itself, the African Union and others. But there's absolutely no doubt that so long as Somaliland can continue to show that it is keeping stability, and it would help if Somaliland, which showed that it could maintain some stable politics, rotation of electoral processes and the like, would actually stick to that, because right now you sort of have run a bit into the sand on that. I think only time will tell. What I would suggest is that Somalilanders, your deeper aspirations notwithstanding, should be watching very carefully what is happening more widely in the region. Is there a wider context within which Somaliland can fit its aspirations in such a way that it doesn't become too narrow and particular, but fits into a wider regional set of arrangements? Because that's where the future really lies, not just vis-à-vis Somalia, but all the neighbors of Somaliland. We need to get very imaginative and think out of the box.
Mary, stay there, because you can use mine.
Thank you. Marta Verbetic, Wilson Center. Question about Brexit. If it happens, when it happens, will it have any influence towards the policy of the Horn of Africa and the European Union's policies? I don't know if this is true, maybe it's wishful thinking of some parties, or perhaps it's concern of other parties that Britain might recognize Somaliland.
Brexit is going to have a very significant effect. I mean, I speak as someone who thinks it damages both the UK and it damages Europe. That's my own view. In Africa, it's going to have, the Horn of Africa is an area where within the European Union, the United Kingdom played a very, very important role in keeping people focused on it. And by championing a region, when the champion leaves and steps out, there is a very, very interesting issue that emerges for the European Union, but also for the countries of the region. Because what they're asking themselves is, what do we bet on now? Is it the UK alone that can deliver, or is it this behemoth called the EU? And if it is the behemoth called the EU, who in the EU? You know, these are the debates that go on. So it's impossible to answer directly the question. It'll sort of unpack itself in time. There's no doubt, though, there will be cooperation that goes on. There's life after Brexit with the UK. Reality will actually dictate that on both sides. It'll be triangular. It'll be the EU, the UK, and the region. And out of that, slowly, in that cuisine, things will emerge.